But if you're going to do something like, if you're going to do like an IK/FK finger setup, where maybe you have a switch that switches them over so you can use FK versus an IK control chain, things like that, you definitely want good orientation on your finger joints without having to do too much work to do it. So the easiest way to do that I've found is to basically use the mesh as the guide, not just visually, but literally in creation of your joints for the fingers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the middle finger. Since the middle finger is sort of dead middle, it runs almost perfectly parallel with our grid line. So it's fairly straight. I'm just going to snap to a few points along its chain to create my finger joints. So I'm going to use my snap to point, which is the little magnet with the ball. Snap the points. Or what you can do is you can press and hold V as in vet on the keyboard, and that'll toggle it on while you're clicking. So select your joint tool from skeleton joints, and then press and hold V or activate snap to point, and then just click over the key rotational points in the finger. And so now with the base joint actually needs to be a little further down, a little more into the palm than it is here, but that was a good place to start, so I used it. And so now I'm about to click one of the last joints here at the tip. So you need sort of an anchor joint here in the tip. I'm going to put it right about here. And okay, so now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 joints. Essentially 1, 2, and 3 that are going to pivot, and then the end joint, which is not necessarily going to pivot unless I decide to add something else on there at the end. Now let me just select my joints, edit, select hierarchy, and then I'm going to decrease their radius just to make them a little easier to differentiate between here. Okay. And so now we have finger joints. Okay. And as before, I can actually take the pivot point of my joints and translate it back. Okay. And since it is perfectly, basically more or less a straight line, I can just use the global orientation of the pivot point and just nudge that back a little bit. Okay, so that looks like it's a pretty good position for my finger joint there. And I can also go through and name these joints, but I'll do that later. Right now, let's just talk about the positioning them. So now that I have my joints, I'm going to switch my manipulator to world orientation. I could nudge it down inside of the hand. In this case, you don't necessarily have to bring them perfectly center. Some people like to bring them so that they're a little more flush with the bottom of the finger. I do not. I try to keep things centered in the geometry. It just tends to work out better in most cases when it comes to weighting, except in very specific cases. So now if I wanted to create finger joints for the rest of the fingers, I could simply duplicate these from the root, and I'll position, go to the top view, just to make it a little easier to check my alignment. And so I'll position these relatively central to where I want the joint to be relative to the finger that it's supposed to control. Okay, so just nudge them over. And the spacing is almost equal in each case. It's a little less sometimes. Okay, so let's say I want the base joint for this pinky to be around here. Okay, so now in each case here, I need to try to match the angle of the finger. So what I do is I select the root joint for that joint structure, and I just rotate it and try to match the angle, or at least get close to it. Okay, sometimes people will actually model fingers and the geometry is a little bent. So I just try to do my best to make sure that at least the joint structure is perfectly straight so that when things are deforming, it doesn't look bent. At least not bent inappropriately. Okay, so now I have a fairly good angle for every finger. Okay, I can nudge it here and there if I don't like it. I still haven't done the thumb yet, but That's going to be a slightly different, a similar approach, but in this case, we're just going to use that one to create its own joint chain, just because in this case, the joint orientation is going to be a little different just because of the angle of the thumb. Okay, so once you have your joints and you have their bases more or less in a position that you think they should be in, just like we did with the arm, you can select the root of each one of those joint chains, at least the ones you had to actually rotate. I don't think I had to do the original at all. And then you go to modify, you can freeze transformation. It's just to zero out just the rotation, not the orientation, because the orientation should basically be consistent with the angle that you created for each one of those chains. Okay? And so then if you need to basically realign the pivot points within that joint chain, or the joints in the joint chain with their pivot locations, where the finger needs to bend more or less, you can basically just select that joint and just translate it using the local orientation to position it where you think it needs to go. And don't forget, when it comes to the fingers, it doesn't really matter where the anchor joint is. It's pretty much all the joints that are basically going to be driving the deformation that we need to worry about. The anchor joint is basically just there to absorb any stray weights at the end. And that's if you want it to absorb any at all. Okay, so just go through your fingers and do that for each one until all of your joints line up inside of the fingers. You can check it from every angle to make sure. So just do it again and again until you're done.